Lydia set her pen down so carefully that no ink was disturbed. But her husband, seated at the other end of the dinner table, had already turned back to his guest and never saw her do it. The guest was a man named Whitfield, a land commissioner from Philadelphia, who had arrived that afternoon with letters of introduction and the particular confidence of someone who expected to be impressed and was not disappointed. He had been speaking for the better part of 20 minutes about crop rotation and railroad access and the county's prospects for the coming decade, and Owen had been listening with the focused attention he reserved for men whose opinions he found useful. Lydia had been listening too. She always listened. The Alderton house sat on 40 acres of Ohio farmland that had been in Owen's family for 3 generations. The main house had been added to twice, once by his grandfather, and once by Owen himself the year after their marriage. A new east wing with a parlor that was too large for 2 people, and a study that Owen used for correspondence he never shared with her. The house was substantial in the way of houses built to communicate stability rather than warmth. Lydia had understood this when she arrived at 23 as a new wife. She had spent the 6 years since making it function the way it was meant to. She arranged the meals that made the right impression. She knew which neighbors held debts against which others, and seated them accordingly. She corresponded with Owen's business contacts' wives in a way that kept the social architecture smooth and unobtrusive. She ran the household accounts with a precision that had saved them twice from expenses. Owen would not have noticed until they became problems. She had never been asked to do any of this. It had simply been clear that it needed doing, and she was the one present to do it. Whitfield turned to her during a pause in the conversation, the way men at dinner tables occasionally remembered that other people were seated at them. "Mrs. Alderton," he said, "you must be proud of what your husband has built here." Lydia smiled. She had been smiling at variations of this sentence for 6 years. "The land does much of the work itself," she said pleasantly. Owen nodded. Margaret managed the household beautifully during the expansion. It was a difficult season. The table held its breath for a moment, in the way that tables sometimes do. Whitfield blinked. Lydia felt it move through her like a thread being pulled, slow and precise and cold. Her name was not Margaret. Margaret was Owen's first wife, Tig. She had died 4 years before their marriage, of a fever that had swept through the county the summer Owen's father was still alive. There was a portrait of Margaret in the upstairs hallway, a formal painting in a gilded frame that Lydia had moved twice to different walls in the first year and stopped trying to move in the second. Owen had not looked up from his wine glass. Whitfield recovered with the ease of a man trained to navigate unexpected social terrain. He said something about the quality of the lamb and lifted his glass, and the conversation moved on. And Lydia lifted her own glass and continued the evening with the smooth competence of a woman who had been producing that particular kind of composure her entire adult life. She did not correct him. She did not flinch. She did not let Whitfield see anything in her face except the calm, gracious expression of a woman presiding over a pleasant dinner. She had been producing that expression for 6 years. It had never failed her in public. Thomas found her afterward in the kitchen garden. He was Owen's younger brother, the only person in the family who had ever spoken to Lydia as though her thoughts on a matter carried any actual weight. He came around the corner of the garden wall, with his hands in his coat pockets, the way he did when he had something to say and wasn't certain how to say it. He didn't notice, Thomas said. No. Lydia was standing at the edge of the herb beds with her back to the house. The late summer air was warm and heavy with the smell of sage. He wasn't trying to. "I know," she said. Her voice was even. "He wasn't trying to do anything. That's the part that's hardest to hold." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He studied her face the way he sometimes did, with the expression of a man watching something happen that he didn't have the tools to stop. "What are you thinking?" he said. Lydia looked out at the garden she had planted and replanted twice, at the beds she had designed for yield rather than appearance, because yield was what the kitchen needed, and at the low stone wall she had arranged to have repaired the previous spring without telling Owen, because by the time she had explained why it needed doing, the project would have taken twice as long. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I've been here for 6 years and he doesn't know my name." She said it without drama. She said it the way you state a fact that has been true for a long time and that you have finally stopped pretending isn't. Thomas had no answer to that. She didn't expect one. She went back inside. She thanked the kitchen staff. She saw that the parlor was put back in order and the good dishes were carried carefully to the back pantry. She did the things she always did at the end of an evening, moving through the house with the quiet efficiency of long practice. And when Owen passed her in the hallway and said good night, with the pleasant distraction of a man who had had a productive evening. She said good night back and watched him go upstairs. She stood in the front hallway alone. The clock on the mantel read 10:30. She went into the study, not Owen's study, but the small room off the parlor that had been nominally a sitting room and had become over 6 years the room where Lydia actually worked. The desk was covered in her correspondence, account ledgers, seed catalogs marked with her annotations, letters from 3 neighboring farms whose wives she had quietly helped navigate agreements, with vendors who had tried to take advantage of widowhood. She sat down at the desk and put her hands flat on the surface. She had told herself for years that this was what a marriage looked like when it was arranged rather than chosen. That Owen was not a bad man, and he was not. He was a man who had married because it was time to marry, who had needed the household managed and the social position maintained, and who had found in Lydia someone capable of doing both. He had not been unkind. He had not been deliberately absent. He had simply, over 6 years, never arrived. She had told herself this so many times, that the telling had become its own kind of discipline. The way you hold a position on a map, not because you are certain it's right, but because changing it requires acknowledging how far you've drifted. She thought about Margaret's portrait in the hallway. She thought about the way Owen had said the name without looking up, without hesitation, without any flickers of awareness that anything had shifted in the room. She thought about Thomas's face in the garden, the expression of a man who had wanted to say something useful and understood that nothing useful could be said. At some point after midnight, in the particular stillness of an Ohio summer night, Lydia stopped telling herself the story she had been telling herself for 6 years. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no particular feeling of liberation or release. It was quieter than that. More like a thread finally breaking after being pulled for so long that the tension had become the only thing she knew. She opened the bottom drawer of the desk. She did not pack like a woman who was frightened. She moved with the careful efficiency she brought to everything, working methodically in the lamplight. Her correspondence, sorted and bundled. Her own account records, kept separate from the household ledger, a habit she had begun in the 2nd year without quite knowing why, and understood now with perfect clarity. Letters from her sister in Indiana. A small sum of money she had set aside from the household accounts over 3 years, not dishonestly. The household accounts were hers to manage, but quietly, the way a woman sets aside something against a need she can't yet name. A brooch that had been her mother's. 2 dresses, practical ones. Her winter coat. She sat for a moment holding the coat, which seemed wrong for August. She packed it anyway. She was thinking past the season. The letter she left was brief. She had thought about it many times in the abstract. The way you think about things you believe will never actually happen. In practice, she wrote 3 sentences. I have done everything that was asked of me, and most of what wasn't. I am not leaving in anger. I am leaving because I have been disappearing 1 year at a time and I would like to stop, before there is nothing left to leave. She did not sign it your wife. She signed it Lydia. She placed it on the kitchen table where Mrs. Holcroft would find it in the morning, because Mrs. Holcroft was a woman of considerable discretion, who would understand enough to say nothing, until it was too late to matter. The house breathed around her as she came downstairs. 40 acres of farmland outside the windows, 6 years of her intelligence and attention, and quiet invisible labor, pressed into every room of it. The arrangement of the furniture that made the front parlor workable for both large gatherings and quiet evenings. The kitchen garden. The household accounts kept with a precision that Owen had complimented once in 6 years, and relied on every day without remarking on it. She had loved this house once. She was not certain, standing in the dark hallway, that she had stopped. But love for a place was not the same thing as permission to vanish inside it. She opened the back door. The night air came in warm and close, full of crickets and the smell of summer fields. Lydia Alderton stepped out of the house she had managed for 6 years, pulled the door closed quietly behind her, and walked toward the road. She did not look back. The morning stage from Caldwell ran at 5:30. Lydia had walked 2 miles to the crossroads and waited on a bench outside the posting office with her bag at her feet, and a cup of bad coffee from the woman behind the counter, who had looked at her once and said nothing, which was exactly what Lydia needed. She bought a seat to Cincinnati. She sat in the corner of the coach with her hands folded in her lap, and watched Ohio roll past the window in the early light, and she let herself feel, for the first time since she had set her pen down the night before, the full weight of what she had done. It was heavier than she expected. It was lighter, too. Both at once, which she had not anticipated. Owen Alderton found the letter at 7 in the morning. He read it once, looking for the part that made sense. He read it a second time, looking for the same thing. He set it on the table. He said to the empty kitchen, "She's gone to her sister's." He said it with the firm reasonableness of a man who has arrived at the correct interpretation of an unclear situation. Lydia's sister lived in Indianapolis. Lydia visited periodically. She had simply gone to her sister and left the note. And the note was phrased strangely, but Lydia had always been given to a kind of precise way of putting things, and he had correspondence to see to before noon. He went to his study. He did not send word to Indianapolis that day. He sent it the following afternoon, when supper had been served incorrectly twice in a row, and he had spent an evening unable to locate a file he needed from the account cabinet, because it was organized according to a system he had never needed to understand, since Lydia had always known where everything was. The reply from Indianapolis arrived 4 days later. "Lydia is not here." Her sister had written it in 4 words, the particular economy of a woman who had been asked to say something and had chosen to say it plainly. Owen read those 4 words standing in the front hall, and something that had been a low-grade discomfort sharpened into something with edges. He sent for Thomas. Thomas arrived the next morning and sat across from Owen in the study, with the expression of a man who had been expecting this conversation and was not looking forward to it. "She left," Owen said. "I need to know where she went." Thomas said nothing for a moment. "She wrote you a letter," he said. "It wasn't clear." "It was very clear." Thomas looked at him steadily. "She said she was leaving. People say things when they're upset. Lydia doesn't say things she doesn't mean." Thomas leaned back slightly. "You know that." Owen set the letter on the desk. "She'll want to come back once she's had time to think." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that the quiet became its own kind of answer. "What?" Owen said. "I'm deciding how to say something in a way that you'll actually hear it. Say it plainly." Thomas looked at him. "At dinner on Tuesday, you introduced your wife to Whitfield by the wrong name. You called her Margaret. In front of a guest, in front of Mrs. Holcroft, who was standing in the doorway, in front of me. You did not correct yourself. You turned back to Whitfield and continued your conversation, and Lydia sat at that table and smiled, and you did not notice what that smile cost her." Owen's jaw tightened. It was a slip. "It was 6 years in a single sentence," Thomas said. "She was not a person to you. She was a function. And the name attached to the function stopped mattering enough to hold." The word sat in the room. "That is not true," Owen said. Thomas looked at him without particular anger and without any inclination to soften the next thing. "Tell me something she told you about herself, something she cares about, something she wants." He paused. "Tell me what she was doing in that room off the parlor every evening for the last 3 years. Owen said nothing. "She was helping women manage their property disputes," Thomas said quietly. "Neighbors, mostly. Women whose husbands had died and who couldn't navigate the land agreements alone. She had correspondence from 6 different households. She was good at it. You never asked what she was doing in there because everything visible was fine, and you didn't need to look further than what was visible." He stood. "You are not a cruel man, Owen, but you have spent 6 years married to a capable woman and treated her like a very reliable piece of the estate, and she has finally decided she would rather be a person somewhere else than a mechanism in a house that runs quietly." He picked up his hat. "I'll ask around," he said, "because you're going to ask me to regardless. But think carefully about what you intend to do when you find her. Because if you go to her expecting her to come home and resume her position, you will lose her permanently, and that will be your own doing entirely." He left. Owen sat in the study for a long time. The house deteriorated faster than he expected. He had understood in an abstract way that Lydia managed things. He had never attached specific content to the word managed, because the result of her management was a household that ran without requiring anything from him, which had seemed like the point. He learned the content of the word within a week. On Wednesday, the kitchen produced the wrong dinner for a neighbor he had invited for supper. A minor thing, except that the neighbor had a digestive complaint that Lydia had apparently known about and accounted for in every meal she had arranged. Owen had not known because it had never needed to be his problem. On Thursday, a letter arrived from a merchant in Columbus, indicating that the account for feed and grain had been managed by Mrs. Alderton directly, and that her negotiated terms were due for renewal, and would someone please be in contact. On Friday he opened the filing cabinet in the parlor room, the one he had never had reason to open because whatever he needed from it had always simply appeared when needed, and discovered a system of such precise organization that he could not understand it at first reading. Every account, every correspondence, every transaction cross-referenced and current. She had not left in chaos. She had left in perfect order. The system was so thorough it would function for months without anyone at the helm. That was the thing he had not expected. Not the leaving, the preparation. He stood in her workroom for a long time. On the road through the county, the whispers had started within a week. Not from the household. Lydia had apparently inspired in every person who worked for her a loyalty that outlasted her presence, but from the neighbor who had attended supper that evening, and from his wife, who had spoken to 2 other women, who had spoken to 4 more. At the county commissioners' meeting in September, a man named Harding pulled Owen aside before the session began, and said, quietly, with the expression of a man delivering news to someone who hadn't read the letter yet, "There's talk, Owen. I thought you'd want to know from someone who means well by it." "What kind of talk?" Owen said. "About Mrs. Alderton, about the dinner, about the name." Harding paused. "People aren't asking what she did wrong. They're asking what you did wrong." "There's a difference," Owen said. "I didn't do anything." Harding looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who understood that this answer, while accurate in one sense, was precisely the wrong answer in every other sense that mattered. "That," he said, "may be the whole problem." He walked back to the commissioner's table. Owen stood where he was. He had spent 6 years building a position in this county, a reputation as a capable man, a man whose land was productive and whose household was well ordered. Lydia had been the quiet architecture of that second part. He had understood her as part of the structure without ever thinking about what it would mean if the structure moved. He was beginning to understand it now. Thomas came back in the 3rd week. "Before I tell you what I've found," Thomas said, "I need to know what you intend." "I intend to bring her home." Thomas shook his head. "You don't bring Lydia anywhere, you ask. And the answer might be no. She is my wife. She is a woman who left you a letter telling you she was done with a situation that was erasing her, and who has been managing on her own for nearly 3 weeks without sending for anyone, and without any sign of intending to return." Thomas looked at him directly. "She is not lost, Owen. She left. There is a considerable difference." A pause. "Where is she?" "Cincinnati. She found lodgings through one of the women she corresponded with, a widow named Mrs. Parrish." Thomas paused. "She's working. She's been helping women manage property disputes formally, through a solicitor there who has taken her on as an advisor. He calls her a research correspondent, which is the closest the paperwork can get to what she actually does. 2 cases in 3 weeks, both successful." Owen said nothing. "She's good at it," Thomas said. And there was something in his voice that occupied the space between admiration and grief. The kind of good that makes you understand she'd been doing it for years without anyone calling it work. He set his hat on the desk. "She declined to see me. She sent word with the woman at the door that she was not receiving visitors from the Alderton house." Calmly, without apparent difficulty. Owen looked up. "She has a housekeeper. She has a life," Thomas said. "That is what I have been trying to tell you." The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before it. Owen said, "I called her Margaret, yes. In front of everyone, not yes. And I didn't." He stopped. He pressed 2 fingers to the edge of his desk. "I didn't even know I'd done it." "No," Thomas said. "You didn't. That's worse." Thomas said nothing because the answer was yes, and Owen had arrived at it himself, and saying it aloud would add nothing. Owen stood. He walked to the window. "What do I do?" he said. And for the first time in 3 weeks, the question was genuine. Not rhetorical. Not the complaint of a man who expected someone else to resolve it. The actual question of a man who did not know. Thomas considered it. "You start," he said, "by understanding that this is not a problem to be managed. It is a wrong to be acknowledged. Those are not the same thing, and they don't use the same methods. And the methods that have made you effective in every other area of your life will not work here." He picked up his hat. "Then you wait. Because she is not going to move toward you until she has seen, not been told, that what comes to her is different from what she left. And if she never sees it." Thomas looked at him steadily. "You will have to live with having had a woman of real capability beside you for 6 years and never understood what she was worth until she was gone. I hope it doesn't come to that, but it might." He left. Owen stood at the window for a long time. The farmland spread out in every direction in the morning light. Everything that was his. Everything he had inherited, and added to and managed with the particular confidence of a man who had never had cause to doubt his own competence. The house was very quiet. He rode to Cincinnati on a Thursday. He had spent 4 days sitting with it seriously, not managing it, not organizing it into categories, simply sitting with it in a way he had almost never done with anything in his life. He had thought about Lydia. Not about the situation. About her. The actual woman. The way she had paused before answering a question, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was making sure the answer was right. The way she had redirected dinner conversations with such ease that he had never once noticed a conversation being redirected. The way she had looked at him, sometimes, with an expression he had always processed as tiredness and understood now, with a clarity he had not asked for, was something else entirely. She had been grieving, quietly, consistently, for years. And he had looked at that expression and turned back to whatever he had been doing. He arrived at the address Thomas had given him. A narrow house on a respectable street, tidy. Smaller than anything Lydia had managed on the Alderton property, the kind of house that communicated a deliberate choice. He knocked. A woman answered, middle-aged, with the calm eyes of someone who had been given instructions and was not interested in departing from them. "I'm here to see Mrs. Alderton," Owen said. "Your name, sir?" "Owen Alderton." The woman looked at him steadily. "Mrs. Alderton is not receiving visitors from the Alderton house. I'm her husband. I'm aware. She is not receiving visitors from the Alderton house." She held out a folded note. He took it. The door closed. He unfolded it on the front step. "I am well. I am not ready to speak with you. I ask that you respect that." 3 sentences. No signature. He stood on that step holding 3 sentences and understood with a force that no negotiation in his life had ever produced that he had no power here. None. He was a man with land and standing and a reputation built over 2 decades. And he was standing outside a narrow house in Cincinnati holding a note from a woman who had decided with complete composure that she was not ready to see him. There was nothing that was going to change that. He went to his lodging. He did not leave Cincinnati. He wrote a letter the following morning. He wrote 6 versions before settling on one that was 3 sentences long, because every version longer than that had turned into a man explaining himself. And he had finally understood, with Thomas's voice somewhere in the back of his mind, that there was nothing to explain. There was only something to admit. "I am not here to ask you to come home. I owe you an apology that I don't know how to write. I would be grateful for the chance to try to say it to you in person, at a time and in a place of your choosing." And sent it. He waited 3 days. Her reply came on a Sunday. Plain paper. Her handwriting, careful and precise. "There is a lecture on Wednesday evening at the Cincinnati Athenaeum. A speaker from the Ohio Bar Association is addressing property rights for women under state law. I will be attending. I will not be attending with you. I will not prevent you from attending the same public event." He read it 4 times. It was not forgiveness. It was not an invitation. It was Lydia doing what Lydia had always done, drawing a clear boundary, leaving a door unlocked, and putting the rope in his hands to do with as he chose. He wrote back 1 word. Wednesday. He arrived early and sat in the back, which was not where Owen Alderton sat at any event in his life. He sat in the back because he was not there as Owen Alderton of the Alderton farm. He was there as a man who had not yet earned the right to sit anywhere else. The room filled. The speaker began. Lydia arrived 7 minutes late with a woman he didn't recognize, older, plainly dressed, who deferred to Lydia in small, definite ways that suggested she was following Lydia's lead through this particular room rather than accompanying her. They sat near the front. Lydia removed her gloves, opened a small notebook, and did not look toward the back of the room. Owen watched her for the better part of an hour. He had been married to her for 6 years. He was watching her now the way you watch a person you are seeing for the first time. She asked a question during the lecture, clear and specific and more precisely formed than most of the questions the men in the room had asked. The speaker answered with the slightly recalibrated respect of a man who had encountered a sharper mind than he'd expected. The woman beside Lydia touched her arm briefly in the way you touch someone when you are proud of them. Lydia smiled, the small private smile of someone who didn't need the approval but was glad for the warmth. It was not the smile she had worn at the dinner table. That smile had been a door closing. This one was simply open. Afterward, in the general movement of people collecting their things, Lydia turned. She had known he was there. Of course she had. She had located him when she entered, processed it, and returned her attention to the lecture. He understood this now. She did not come to him. She waited near her seat, and when the crowd thinned he walked to her. "Lydia," he said. "Owen." Her voice was level, not cold, not warm. The careful neutrality of a woman who had decided to take this 1 minute at a time. "You look well," he said. "I am well." She said it simply, the way people say things that are simply true. "I came because I wrote to you that I owed you an apology. I still do." He held her gaze. "I keep starting from the wrong place when I try to write it." "What's the wrong place?" "Myself," he said. "Every version starts with me. What I meant, what I didn't mean, why I was the way I was." He paused. "That's the problem, isn't it? Every version of everything for 6 years started with me." The room was nearly empty now. The woman Lydia had come with stood near the door, giving them distance with the particular tact of someone who had been briefed. Lydia said, "What are you asking, Owen?" "I'm asking if you'll allow me to call on you, not to persuade you of anything. I have a list of things I'd like to say that are not arguments. I'd like to say them to you directly, because I think you deserve that." Lydia was quiet for a moment. "I don't think your guilt is the same thing as my safety," she said. The words went into him like a key turning. He didn't answer immediately, because there was no immediate answer worth saying. He stood with it. She watched him stand with it. The fact that he didn't deflect or reframe seemed to register in her expression, not as forgiveness, but as information. "No," he said. "It isn't, you're right." She held his gaze for another moment. "I walk by the river on Saturday mornings," she said. "Near the public wharf, from 9 until 10. I am not inviting you. I am telling you where I am." She collected her notebook and her gloves. "Good evening, Owen." She walked to the door, said something brief and warm to the woman waiting there, and they left together. Owen stood in the emptied hall. He was in the Riverside Park at 8:30 on Saturday. He had a tendency toward lateness that had, apparently, been among the things that had silently worn on Lydia over the years. And for once in his life he intended to arrive early and simply wait. She came at exactly 9. She walked with Mrs. Parrish, who saw him first and whose expression communicated several things without words, none of them hostile and none of them warm. Lydia said to her companion, "Give us a few minutes." Mrs. Parrish moved down the path. Lydia sat on the far end of a bench, measured, not close, not distant, deliberate. "You came," she said. "You told me where you'd be. I also told you it wasn't an invitation." "I know." He looked at her. "I thought you'd expected me anyway." Something moved briefly in her face. Not quite humor, not quite not. "Yes," she said, "I had." He drew a breath. "When Thomas told me you were working with the solicitor, helping with the property cases, he said you were good at it." He paused, and the way he said it, I realized I had no right to be surprised. "You had been doing the same work for years. For our neighbors, in that room off the parlor, in the evenings when I walked past without asking what you were doing. I called it managing. I called it quietly, the way you'd say the stove keeps the house warm, not as something a person does, as something that simply happens." Lydia said nothing. "I called you Margaret," he said, "in front of everyone, and I didn't know I had done it. That is the thing I cannot get past. Not that the name came out, that it came out that easily. As though the woman at my table had become interchangeable with a function. As though your name had stopped mattering enough to hold." His voice had gone lower. He was not performing this. She would have known. "I have been trying to understand how I became a man who did that to you, and I keep arriving at the same answer. I never had to try. You made everything function so completely that I never had to notice anything. And I mistook the fact that nothing required my attention for the fact that everything was fine. It hadn't been fine for a long time," Lydia said quietly. "I know that now. You didn't want to know it then." "No," he said. "I didn't. It would have required something from me that was easier not to give." She turned to look at him directly, for the first time since she had sat down. Her face was composed, but composed in the way of something real. "Not managed. What do you want, Owen? Honestly." He held her gaze. "I want to know you. The way a person deserves to be known by the person they live beside. Not as a function, as a person." He paused. "That's not the same as wanting you back." "No," she said. "It isn't. I'm not asking you to come back. I understand that what I'm asking for isn't something I've earned. I'm asking because the alternative is going home to a house that works perfectly and is entirely empty of everything that made it worth living in." Lydia was quiet for a long time. "Come back Saturday," she said. "Same time." He went still. To talk, to talk. "I'm not promising you anything beyond Saturday, Owen. And if you come here with the intention of managing toward a particular outcome, I will end the conversation, and I won't offer another one. Understood?" "Come back Saturday," she said again. She stood. She called to Mrs. Parrish, and they walked down the path together. Owen sat on the bench and watched them go. He had come to Cincinnati expecting to retrieve something. He was beginning to understand that what he actually needed to do was far more uncertain than retrieval. He needed to earn the right to stand beside something he had never properly valued. Sitting in the Ohio morning light, he did not know if he was capable of it. That uncertainty, he realized, was the first honest thing he had felt in a very long time. He came back. The following Saturday and the one after that. They talked by the river, an hour each time. And Lydia held the terms of every conversation with the consistency of a woman who had learned at considerable cost that her own terms were worth holding. He could not speak of the farm. He could not begin any sentence with the assumption of a shared future. What he could do was listen, and he found, slowly, that he was better at it than he had been. She told him about the cases she was working on, the property disputes, the women navigating courts that had not been designed with them in mind. And he asked specific questions, and he remembered what she'd said and connected it to what she said the following week. It was the kind of conversation Lydia recognized with a feeling she didn't welcome, that she had wanted from him for 6 years. She stored this observation privately. She did not produce it for him. It was hers, and she had learned that what was hers was worth keeping. Mrs. Parrish had opinions. She expressed them over supper in the direct way of a woman who considered honesty a form of care. "He's trying," she said one evening. "He is," Lydia said. "The question is whether trying now means anything given how long he wasn't." Lydia looked at her. "You've arrived at the exact question I'm sitting with." Mrs. Parrish poured coffee. "What does your gut tell you? That he's genuinely different than he was?" Lydia set her cup down. "My gut also tells me that I would have given anything for this version of him 4 years ago, 3 years ago, last year." She paused. "And I don't entirely know what to do with the grief of that." Mrs. Parrish said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. In the 4th week, Owen began writing to her between their Saturday meetings. Not appeals, not arguments. Something closer to thinking out loud on paper. He wrote about what Thomas had said in the study. He wrote about standing at the window after Thomas left and understanding for the first time that the house hadn't failed because Lydia was gone. The house was fine. He was the one failing. In one letter, he wrote about his father, briefly, with the care of a man examining something he had never examined before. The particular model of marriage his father had demonstrated, in which a wife was a household, was a function, and a function did not require you to look at it directly as long as it kept working. He wrote it not as an excuse but as an explanation he was still moving through. Lydia read every letter. She replied to some of them, briefly, precisely, without warmth but without coldness. She confirmed she had read what he'd written. She responded where she had something specific to say. She did not offer more than the exchange required. It was Thomas who sent her a separate note, telling her that Owen had apparently read her silences as carefully as her replies, and had told Thomas that the absence of response to certain letters told him as much as any response could, because Lydia's silences had always carried information if a person was paying attention. "He is paying attention now," Thomas wrote, "for whatever that is worth to you." Lydia folded the note and put it in the box where she kept correspondence she needed to think about. The break came in October, and it did not come from a conversation. Lydia arrived at the offices of the solicitor she worked with, a man named Hartley, with a woman named Mrs. Deering, whose late husband had died without a will and whose brother-in-law had contested her right to their shared business property. Lydia had been preparing the case for a month. She had found 2 legal precedents Hartley himself had missed. Hartley received them with the practiced tolerance of a man who was accustomed to capable women, appearing where he hadn't expected them, and had developed a way of acknowledging them that managed to feel like both acceptance and condescension simultaneously. He reviewed the petition. He noted the precedents with a pause that told her he had not expected them to be there. He said he would proceed. Then, as an afterthought, leaning back in his chair, "Mrs. Alderton, you should know, your husband called on me last week. He's made a contribution to the Hamilton County Women's Legal Fund. A considerable one, I'll say, specifically directed to property dispute cases. He asked that no announcement be made, no credit given. Rather unusual in my experience." Lydia went very still. "When?" she said. 3 weeks ago, I believe. I assumed you knew." "I did not," she said. She finished the meeting. She walked Mrs. Deering home. She said goodbye with the warmth she always brought to it, and then she walked back to her own house in the October afternoon and stood in the front room without taking off her coat. 3 weeks ago. Before last Saturday's conversation, before the letter about his father, before any of it. He had done it quietly, with no announcement, with specific instructions that his name not be attached, and she had found out through a solicitor who assumed it was common knowledge. She stood there for a long time. Then she took Thomas's note from the box and read it again. "He is paying attention now. For whatever that is worth to you." The feeling that moved through her was not simple. It was not the warmth of being won over. It was sharper than that. It was the grief that lived underneath the warmth, the unavoidable fact that this man, this version of him, had been possible all along. He had been in there somewhere for 6 years, and she had waited and made herself smaller and arranged everything around what he needed, and waited some more, and he had never arrived. Not until she had left. She sat down in the chair by the window and let herself feel that honestly, not to weaponize it, not to store it as ammunition, Just to feel it, because it was real, and it was hers, and she had spent too many years setting her own feelings down quietly, so quietly that no one heard. She did not bring it up the following Saturday. She had intended to. She had planned, walking to the park, to say something direct, but when she sat down and looked at him, she noticed he was thinner than he'd been in August. Not dramatically. Enough. He had the look of a man who had not been sleeping well and had stopped trying to conceal it. He asked about Mrs. Deering's case before she could say anything, because she had mentioned it the week before, and he had remembered. She answered. They talked for the full hour. She watched him listen. She watched him ask follow-up questions that showed he had been thinking about what she'd said between Saturdays. She felt something shift, slowly, toward something more specific. Not forgiveness. Forgiveness implied a clear line you could step over. This was more like she had stopped bracing. She had stopped waiting for him to slip back into the man who had called her Margaret without looking up. She was not sure when that had happened. Thomas came to her door on a Friday afternoon in November, and sat down heavily and said he signed documents. She set her cup down. What documents? A property settlement, in your name. Independent, formal, final. He consulted 2 lawyers. If you never return to the marriage, you have financial security that cannot be contested. If you return, it remains yours. He has no access to it. It's yours in a way that Ohio law almost never gives a wife anything. Thomas paused. He asked me to tell you. He said he couldn't tell you himself without it sounding like evidence in a case he was building, and he didn't want it to be that. A pause. He said it was the first concrete thing he could actually do, and that it should have been done years ago, before you had any reason to need it. Lydia was quiet for a long time. The same week as the legal fund contribution, she said. The same week. She stood and walked to the window. She stayed there long enough that Thomas didn't speak. When she turned back, her face was composed. Her eyes were something else. He did both of those things, she said, before any of our recent conversations, before the letters, before any of it. He wasn't holding them in reserve. He wasn't waiting to use them. No, Thomas said. He wasn't. Thomas, she looked at him. Is he actually different? Not because I'm gone and the house isn't running right. Actually different. Thomas considered this with the care of a man who understood exactly how much the answer mattered. I think, he said carefully, that he has understood something he cannot ununderstand. Whether that understanding changes a man permanently, I can't promise you. What I can tell you is that the man who sat across from me in September and said Lydia was making a point and would be back by next week is not the same man I've been speaking with these past 2 months. Something broke open. I believe it's real. He looked at her. I cannot guarantee it stays open. That's an honest answer, she said. You asked for one. You're one of the few people who gives them to me. She sent him a note that evening. Come to the park Saturday at 8 instead of 9. I'd like more time. He arrived at 10 to 8. She was already there. They sat for a while in the ordinary way. Then she said, I know about the settlement documents. He looked at her. Thomas told you? Yes, he asked me to. Owen nodded once, slowly. I couldn't tell you myself. I was afraid it would sound like I was presenting evidence. Like I was building a case to get you back. He looked at his hands briefly, then at her. I didn't want it to be that. I wanted it to be what it should have been. What a man does for a woman he actually respects, before there's anything to prove. Just, he paused, because it's right. Lydia sat with that. Why didn't you, she said, years ago. He was quiet for a long time, not evasive, actually thinking. It didn't occur to me, he said, and it didn't occur to me because I had never, he stopped, started again. I had never thought about what you needed. I thought about the farm, the accounts, the land, the county position, and you were part of how all of that functioned. I told myself that providing for you, maintaining the property, the standing, I told myself that was the same as caring for you. He looked at her directly. It wasn't the same thing. It was the easiest version of the obligation dressed up as the complete one. Lydia held his gaze. I spent 6 years, she said, being grateful for what I had, because I had been taught that gratitude was the correct response to provision, that it was enough. Her voice was steady. Underneath it, something was not. I told myself I was being reasonable, that I was managing a life most women would have been glad to have, and all the while I was disappearing, in very small increments, so gradually I almost didn't notice. I noticed, he said quietly, once. About 3 years in, I noticed you'd stopped laughing at meals. I thought you were tired. I had the kitchen prepare your favorite dishes for a week and I told myself you seemed better. Lydia was very still. I did seem better that week, she said. Her voice held for a moment. Because I thought you had seen me. I thought that week meant you were paying attention. A pause. And when it didn't last, When things went back to what they were, I think that was the week I started understanding that I was on my own. The honesty of that sat between them. Owen said nothing for a moment. Something moved through his face that was not quite grief, and was not far from it. "I'm sorry, Lydia," he said it quietly. "Not for the dinner, not for 3 years ago. For all of it I know," she said. And she meant it, not as absolution, as acknowledgement. Something real passing between two people who had been in the same house for 6 years, and were finally, for the first time, in the same conversation. She asked the question she had come to ask. "If I told you I would never come back to what we were, that I would keep this house, this work, Mrs. Parrish, my name in this city, my independence, would you still want to be in my life?" He did not hesitate. "Yes. Not because you hope I'll change my mind, not because of that, because you actually want to know me, on whatever terms are possible." "Yes," he said. "That exactly." She studied his face. Most men would find that arrangement insufficient. A wife who lives in a different city, who does work that makes her visible in ways that complicate your standing in the county. "Your neighbors will have opinions." "They already do," he said. "I find I care about that considerably less than I did in August." He held her gaze. "Lydia, I spent 6 years building a life that looked exactly right from the outside, and discovered the moment you left that I had no idea what it felt like from inside." He paused. "I don't want a life that looks right. I want one that is. And you are the only person I have ever known who understood instinctively what the difference was." The park was quiet around them in the November morning, leaves down, the air carrying the first real edge of winter. Lydia sat in the middle of it and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not safety, not yet, but the beginning of the conditions under which safety might eventually become possible. "Come back next Saturday," she said. He went, very still. "And the one after that," she said. "And Owen?" She stood, smoothed her coat, looked at him directly. "I am not promising you anything beyond the next conversation. I need you to hear that." "I hear it. But I am," she paused, chose carefully, "no longer assuming the worst of what you might become. That is not a small thing, coming from me. I need you to understand what it costs to get there." He stood. "I understand," he said. "I won't waste it." She held his gaze one moment longer. Then she called to Mrs. Parrish, who came forward from her polite distance with the expression of a woman who had been watching carefully and had formed several conclusions she would be sharing over supper. Lydia walked toward her. Behind her, Owen Alderton stood in the November park and did not move for a long time. He had come to Cincinnati expecting to retrieve his wife. What was being offered to him, slowly, on terms that were entirely hers, was something he had never possessed in the first place. The chance to deserve her. He had not understood, until this moment, how different those two things were. The winter meetings became the architecture of something neither of them had named. December arrived, and they moved their conversations to the reading room of the Cincinnati Library, where they sat across a small table and talked with the particular intensity of two people who had agreed, without saying so explicitly, that honesty was the only language worth using. He told her things he had never told anyone. She asked specific questions and waited for real answers, and he discovered, slowly, that being asked a genuine question by someone who actually wanted the answer was an experience he had almost never had. She told him about the case that had changed the way she understood her own capabilities. A woman named Mrs. Deering, whose brother-in-law had assumed that grief and inexperience made her vulnerable, and who had discovered that Mrs. Alderton's correspondence had assembled a more thorough legal argument than anything the brother-in-law's attorney had produced. He listened. He remembered it the following week and asked a follow-up question. "You could have told me," he said one afternoon, "about the work you were doing, about the women. You never asked what I was doing in that room." "No," he paused. "I didn't think to ask. And I didn't think to ask because everything I needed was arriving correctly, and I had learned somewhere, from my father I think, from watching how he ran things, that you don't examine a system that isn't failing." He looked at her. "It is a terrible way to be married to a person." "Yes," she said. "It was not unkind. It was simply true," he said. "What made you decide that night? What was the exact moment?" She considered it. "I was standing in the dining room," she said. "After everyone had gone, looking at the chairs. I can tell where every person sat by how they push back when they stand. Judge Ferris's chair always goes straight back. Whitfield's was turned toward the door before dessert, which meant he was ready to leave earlier than he said." She looked at Owen. "I know all of it, every detail of every evening. The debts and the alliances and the conversations that needed redirecting and the ones that could be left to run. And the man at the head of the table," she paused, "did not know my name." She held his gaze steadily. It wasn't a metaphor, Owen. He literally used someone else's name. And I thought, if I stay past tonight, I will be standing in that dining room again next year, knowing whose chair is whose, and he will still not know mine. And the year after that. She exhaled. I was not willing he sat with that. I'm glad you weren't, he said quietly. She looked at him. I'm glad you left. He said it clearly. I would not be sitting here if you hadn't. I would be in that house, looking at a county calendar, telling myself the household was running well, and you would have been disappearing one more year at a time. Neither of us would have known it was happening. He looked at her directly. You leaving was the only thing that made me capable of sitting in this room. Lydia was quiet. Something shifted in her face, the way ice shifts in early spring. Not breaking. Releasing. That, she said, is the most honest thing you have ever said to me. I know. He held her gaze. I have some ground to make up. And Lydia, for the first time in a very long time, surprised out of herself, laughed, a real one, brief and unguarded, and she pressed two fingers to her lips as though catching it. Then she let it go. Owen watched it happen with the expression of a man who has just found something he thought was gone sitting 3 feet away from him. The Cincinnati Athenaeum hosted its winter lecture series in December, and Lydia was invited to speak on a panel alongside 2 attorneys and a judge about the practical gaps in Ohio property law as it affected women managing estates after bereavement. She had been corresponding with the panel organizer for 2 months. It was the first time she had been asked to speak rather than assist. She told Owen about it on a Saturday in late November. I'd like you to be there, she said, not beside me. Not presenting yourself as anything. In the room, because I'd like to look up and see someone who is proud of me doing it. Not tolerating it. Proud. He looked at her for a moment. I will be there, he said. Don't be performative about it, she said. I know you'll know, he said. I'll be there. He sat in the 4th row on the evening of the lecture. The room was well attended, professional men mostly, a handful of women near the front. Lydia was the last panelist introduced, and the only woman on the panel, and when the moderator gave her name, Owen watched the slight recalibration move through the room. She spoke with the clarity of someone who had been thinking about these questions for years and had finally been given a room in which to say so. She cited cases. She named specific statutory failures. She made one argument that visibly shifted the room's attention, and that the judge on the panel acknowledged, with some reluctance, as a point he had not considered in quite that framing. Afterward, a man near Owen turned to his companion and said, Who is she? Before his companion could answer, Owen said clearly and without being asked, Mrs. Lydia Alderton. She runs the Hamilton County Widows legal petition work. There isn't anyone in this room who knows the property courts better than she does. The man turned, recognized Owen by name, and nodded with the slightly startled respect of someone revising his understanding. Lydia, 4 rows forward, heard it. She did not turn around immediately. She let it move through her, the way something new moves through a person who has waited a long time for it without quite believing it was coming. Then she turned her head, just slightly. Just enough. Owen was looking at her, not with the managed expression of a man maintaining appearances. Not with the absent gaze of a man looking toward a sound. With attention. Full, unperformed, specific attention. The look of a man who saw the woman in front of him and knew exactly who she was. Lydia looked back at him across those 4 rows, and she smiled. Not the smile she had worn at the dinner table in August, when she had set her pen down so carefully and made a decision no one saw. Not the composed, managed smile of 6 years of making everything work without credit or acknowledgement. Not the smile of a woman arranging her face into the expression the room required. This smile was hers. The smile of a woman who had walked out of a farmhouse in Ohio before dawn, with 1 bag and her own name. Who had found a narrow house in Cincinnati, and a housekeeper who argued with her about property law, and a collection of women who needed exactly what she knew how to give, who had sat across a table in a riverside park, and offered terms on her own authority, and watched a man she had once arranged her entire life around choose, with his eyes open and nothing to gain but honesty, to meet her there. She was not someone who needed to be retrieved. She was not someone who needed to be forgiven, or persuaded, or returned to where she had been. She was someone who had needed to be seen. And in a Cincinnati lecture hall in December, in the voice of a man who said her name clearly and correctly in front of everyone, Lydia Alderton turned back to the panel, picked up her notes and continued her argument. She had more to say. She intended to say it.